We stumbled on the Dingy Skipper in South Yorkshire purely by chance. We had gone to the funeral in Kiveton Park, near Sheffield, of our dear friend John Dennis, a former miner who had died prematurely of drink and diabetes. On the day before his funeral in late May 2002, we had wandered dejectedly onto the spoil heap of Kiveton Park pit, and to our delight had found masses of dingy skippers, and, at a rough guess, a 10,000-strong colony of the very variable common blues. It was like John had risen from the dead, for he loved nature, as did many another miner, and had he known about these butterflies, he would have cherished and protected them. He would have had no qualms about mounting a picket to protect the butterfly either, for he knew only direct action was going to save the planet. 3 years later, there is not one dingy skipper to be seen at Kiveton, and the common blues are reduced to a pitiful rump. Over the following days we kept returning to the site to try and get an indication of its size. It was far larger than we first thought, and the colony appeared to be concentrated around the old clock tower that formerly belonged to the colliery, and the pit baths, which have since acquired heritage status. However, they were to be found in greater numbers on the wooded side of the spoil heap, facing the road towards Hart Hill, particularly on the fringes and in the clearings not yet completely covered by the encroaching Carr woodland. Our on-the-spot estimate indicated that there were around 300 to 400 dingy skippers on the wing at the height of the emergence. 3 years later, there was not one dingy skipper to be seen at Kiveton, and the common blues were reduced to a pitiful rump of about 20 or so adults. In the meantime, a supposedly eco-conscious, very destructive amenity makeover had finished off the former spoil heap's amazing biodiversity. What we have here are the elegiac first and last film clips of the Dingy Skipper at Kiveton. The film was shot on a blustery day in May 2004, mainly in Carr woodland clearings and on the burnt shell path that climbed up the spoil heap. As we silently dwell on these historic shots for a while, listen to the buffeting wind and other ambient sounds. Following the relentless Dash for Gas programme that had provoked the Great Miners' Strike of 1984-85, Kiveton Park Colliery had closed in 1994 as a direct consequence of the brutal wholesale pit closures government directive of 1993. Prior to that, some seeding and planting of trees had already taken place. Once the pit head winding gear came down and the shaft filled in, the National Coal Board had been under some kind of legal obligation to make good the rest of the bare spoil heap. Heaps of trefoil, clover and kidney vetch seed were scattered over the 22 acres that comprised the spoil heap. It was like a desert had bloomed, and the acres of kidney vetch were especially breathtaking. This cut-price, haphazard though ecologically very effective seeding must have considerably helped expand the Dingy Skipper and common blue populations, both forming major colonies in a very short space of time. On the North Downs in Surrey, a flush of kidney vetch will prompt a search for the small blue butterfly. Here there were enchanting acres of the stuff, and we were reminded the nearest colony of small blues was not far away in Derbyshire. In fact, from the top of Kiveton's spoil heap, the site was almost visible through the blue haze that bathed the Derbyshire Dells above the M1 motorway. But this ecologically successful makeover was merely a stopgap measure, an unintended consequence of the real aim, which was to eventually sell off the land. This temporary greening of the abandoned spoil heaps was increasing the asset value of the National Coal Board's land portfolio and making them less of a financial liability than if they had been allowed to stay as they were. Besides, nature was poised to take back their grim majesty in any case. The English Coalfield Regeneration Programme was made up of 62 sites, the assorted spoil heaps being the largest portfolio of contaminated land in Europe, covering 3,400 hectares, or the equivalent in terms of space of 95,000 low-density homes. A land transfer of enormous proportions is the eventual aim, the transfer of land from public, i.e. state ownership, to private ownership being presented as the key factor in generating development and wealth. The idea was that such a transfer would facilitate property development and thereby property-led urban regeneration. This notion is very much of its time, the defeat of the 1984-85 miners' strike greatly speeding up the flotation of state-owned companies, especially gas, electricity and water on the stock exchange. To attract investors and ultimately a purchaser, the spoil heaps had first to undergo a facelift, paid for by UK and European state agencies. And this is how Kiveton came to be designated an anodyne play and recreational area. The client body that now owns Kiveton, and nominally responsible for the makeover, is Renaissance South Yorkshire, in fact a subsidiary body of the Whitehall-appointed Yorkshire Forward. A government-funded creation in its entirety, the Kiveton makeover cannot pretend to be a product of free enterprise, a fact which goes against the grain of the prevailing neoliberalism. So, to be rid of that stigma, Renaissance South Yorkshire is now hoping to denationalise this landholding as quickly as possible by finding a buyer on the open market. Initially, its exit strategy for the site had been the Land Reclamation Trust and British Waterways, though there appears to be absolutely nothing left of the Chesterfield Canal, which once ran through the site. At its centre are two fully lined large fishing ponds, easily accessible by that all-important piece of noxious junk on wheels, the car. There are also 11 kilometres of paths, some of which are laughingly referred to as nature walks. Several miles distant from Sheffield, it has been spared the entertainment mega-blitz that has been the fate of the Orgreave spoil heap on the perimeter of Sheffield, also once a Dingy Skipper foothold, and the site of a legendary battle during the miners' strike. Even so, one of the advertised attractions of the remade Kiveton spoil heap is the proximity of Meadow Hall Shopping Centre, or rather, Retail Therapy Centre, as it is referred to in the sickening postmodernist language of the glossy spoiled heap brochures that are now flooding the coalfields. English Partnerships, an umbrella group comprising Yorkshire Forward and Renaissance South Yorkshire, which liaises with local authorities as part of the Value Added Towns programme, drew up the overall plan. Value added always implies an increase in new build and home ownership and a monumentous shift away from traditional industries towards concept, design, marketing and finance, otherwise speculatively referred to in the post-minor New Britain as the creative industries. The Assanine myth of a work-based creativity spreading out to encompass all of everyday life permits an increasingly deindustrialized Europe and America to believe they will forever maintain economic and cultural hegemony over China and India. It is also the ground on which a moribund installation art and an insipid ecology flourishes, the union of both becoming increasingly important to the post-industrial capitalism of the developed world. The cost of the Kiveton spoil heap makeover was put at £9.5 million. After the overall plan was drawn up for Kiveton, the contracts were divided up between Cheetham Hill Construction, White, Young and Green, and the Ensia Bioremediation Group. In this subcontracted world, how many other subcontractors were involved is anybody's guess. The general idea was to link, quote, environmental quality with economic investment decisions. What that means is plain to see from the results obtaining at Kiveton, as is the usual predictable blurb about creating a prosperous and sustainable economy. More specifically, there were regeneration budgets and derelict land grants to aid land reclamation. Derelict land is defined for purposes of giving grants as land so damaged by industrial and other developments that it is incapable of beneficial use without treatment. Though this sounds sensible and praiseworthy, it hinges on what is meant by beneficial use, because the final result does not benefit nature at all, and therefore cannot be said to be of benefit to humans either. Considerable emphasis has been given at Kiveton to land restoration, which is where the Ensia Group comes in, 40 hectares of soil being cleansed of all hazardous waste. Soil amelioration, as the process is called, has become compulsory on industrially derelict sites since a European Union directive was enacted in July 2004. In fact, most of the European directives have to do with the environment, including landfill, hazardous waste, surface waters, pollution prevention and control and conservation of natural habitats. However, once they reach Britain, the directives are mixed with a noxious eco-neoliberalism and become the truth, the whole truth, and nothing like the truth. At Kiveton, soil amelioration meant that all top contaminated shale or other soil was removed on a massive scale to be aerated and sampled. Lime and other nutrients were added, and finally the whole lot returned to the site. Ensia insists that no new topsoil was ever brought in from elsewhere. This is a sales pitch with a vengeance, for tons of soil have been freshly dumped on the site, utterly obliterating the spoil heap's top layers of burnt shale and tiny bits of coal, which gave the spoil heaps their characteristic ochre and dark grey colours. Certainly, the imported soil was not cleansed of alien seeds, as fat hen, charlock, nettles and thistles are now to be seen in abundance, choking off the sparse original vegetation. This was followed up by a seeding in mechanically pricked out rows of ryegrass, the living equivalent of astroturf, giving the place the appearance of a permanent artificial spring. Cheetham Hill Construction Limited should really be renamed Cheating Hill Destruction Limited, for their promotional statutes proudly proclaim, "We are committed to complying with environmental legislation and have specific site procedures to address waste management, silt pollution and working in proximity to protected species." Adding, "Due to our extensive environmental management system, we have recently been awarded the prestigious Green Apple Award." The Rotten Apple Award would have been more appropriate. One of the other construction companies, Burst Civils, also received an award for its remedial destruction of the spoil heap's great promise. Orwellian newspeak is the rule on these pit spoil heap makeovers, but just occasionally there are touches of humour which leavens the grim sequence of destruction. Perched on the top of the former Woolly Colliery spoil heap one day, disconsolately watching the truckloads of alien soil being delivered to what is another ultra-commercial makeover, we suddenly noticed that the firm responsible for the carting operation was called Wordsworth Excavations Limited. You couldn't make this chance irony up. The Health and Safety Executive is also in the grip of the pervading irrationality and cannot be questioned. Once so helpful in improving health and safety at work and safeguarding the lives of ordinary people, much contemporary legislation makes little sense and is arguably even harmful. The EU Contaminated Soil Directive is a case in point, but it will help fill the order books of firms like Vertace and Ensia that specialise in the cleaning up of industrially derelict sites, leaving behind insipid flower beds of pansies and primulas, and a sign advertising their wares where once sparse grasses, trefoil, thistle and buddleia were allowed to grow unmolested. The spoil makeovers were also dummy runs for even more lucrative contracts for environmental consultancies. On the Olympic Park site and in the Thames Gateway, there are very big prizes to be had indeed. However, by far the biggest factor determining the outcome of the Kiveton spoil heap makeover horror has to be the new large private housing estate that lies on the flat land to the side of the pit baths and old colliery offices. We need look no further than this for an explanation. House price inflation has now become the motor of the economy, as it is in America. Mildly eco-conscious, as most people are nowadays, the recent tenants of these new estates would have expressed regret if at a later date they were told the Dingy Skipper had now gone from the made-over spoil heaps. But if we had pointed out to residents in 2004-2005 that the butterfly which then teemed on the Kiveton Park spoil heap, and would continue to do so only if the spoil heap was kept just as it was, then the initial enthusiasm of these same residents would have rapidly waned. For estate agents' descriptions increasingly include outlook as a selling point, and the difference between an unmodified and a made-over Kiveton Park or a woolly spoil heap can add or subtract £10,000 easily from the value of a property. When put like this, there is no contest, even if it does mean the loss of an endangered butterfly. The joint venture spearheaded by Yorkshire Forward is nothing if not media savvy. The absence of even the most elementary democracy explains why this is so, the media substituting for the growing lack of basic democratic rights. Yorkshire Forward is one of the 9 regional development agencies created during the late 1990s by the Labour government. They are appointed by and responsible to the Secretary of State, and hence ruled directly from Westminster. Fearful there was too much coercion and not enough consent, these regional development agencies were to become the basis of regional assemblies, which were rejected by people in the north and west as just another irrelevant tier of bureaucracy that would end up paying for through the nose. Zero contamination becomes zero nature, and gone are the rare plants, butterflies, insects and birds which thrived in this industrially generated wilderness. Gone are the little ring plover, the dingy skipper, brown argos, common blue, and the different species of orchids. Doubtless there are many more species. The greater rationality has been buried with the contaminated soil in the binding legality of officially authorised landfill. If the present legislation was to become retrospective, most of the mendips would be cordoned off with razor wire, and the inhabitants of Cornwall cleared off the land, their homes flattened because of radon gas contamination. It rapidly became clear Yorkshire Forward and Renaissance South Yorkshire are autocratic bodies. They rarely have the decency to even reply to letters. Top management are absolutely against any ecological incentives and want ecologists that get in the way out of the way. If they refuse to budge, Yorkshire Forward and Renaissance South Yorkshire don't hesitate to turn their fire on them, especially on awkward eco-groups like the SK58 birders, who had been included in the official regeneration plan. We collaborated with the latter, and they were very helpful and did far more to save the Dingy Skipper than official butterfly conservation groups. Bird watching always has been a more popular pastime than the pursuit of butterflies and moths, and this is reflected in the far greater willingness of birders to take on authority. Rotherham Council is a little better, but not much, and did at least listen to SK58 birders. After much petitioning, Rotherham Council was able to get Renaissance South Yorkshire to agree to leave the Carr woodland on the slopes of Kiveton spoil heap, which probably once was the main breeding ground of the butterfly, at least on the slopes, especially where the wood is thinned out. Renaissance South Yorkshire was in favour of completely chopping this area down, because a job well done on the spoil heap is one that leaves no trace of the past. And that is how the scrub woodland on the slope has come to be left, but to no avail, because the indispensable bare spoil around the perimeter of the Carr woodland, the Dingy Craves, has been covered up and grassed over. Worse than that, however, is the fact that the bird's foot trefoil, the food plant of the Dingy Skipper and common blue, has been all but eliminated throughout the entire 40 hectares, and yet Yorkshire Forward had promised, though not in writing, to blanket the makeover in trefoil. The flashy fold-up propaganda sheets that were given away free in the local library and forewarned of the imminent makeovers are couched in an ultra-democratic, consultative, ecologically aware language all the more striking because so phony. This fastidious, politically correct bigotry could turn out on occasion to be true. There is now a disability ramp that zigzags across both sides of the former Kiveton spore heap incline, though we have yet to see it being used, other than by cyclists. This is no joking matter, for it gets worse. When Mick Clay of SK58 Birders pointed out that the thick covering of topsoil would destroy the Dingy Skipper's habitat, as the bare spoil was essential to them, it was seriously suggested that he collect all the tiny, hard-to-see eggs of the Dingy Skipper, which the nerd from Yorkshire Forward assumed to be the size of ostrich eggs, and take them to a spot where they would thrive. Though Yorkshire Forward had promised to seed the site with trefoil, it was Walworth's all-purpose long grass that won the day, which, except for skylarks, birds dislike. This fluorescent grass was sown right up to the outer edges of the scrapes, and only succeeded in frightening off the waders the scrapes were designed to attract. Yorkshire Forward now has the cheek to say its pot of money is now empty, and cannot afford to reinstate even some of the spoil by removing the 18 inches of clay and topsoil that has been the cause of all the damage. The bastards. As a reward for their plans, SK58 Birders were not invited to the official opening because they were viewed as troublemakers. Stooping to black propaganda, the local press, prompted quite obviously by Yorkshire Forward, began to hound the Birders, printing scurrilous articles about them. It was suggested that SK58 Birders had attempted to get a children's hospice, the Bluebell Wood, moved off the site in order to save the little ringed plover. In reality, what was in dispute was not the hospice itself, though it had been made to appear that way, but the siting of the approach road which ran close to the nesting area of the little ringed plover, through a Dingy Skipper colony, and over the other unusual flora that can be found there, like the masses of bee orchids. Birders, and Mick Clay especially of SK58 Birders, began to get nervous walking through local streets and were afraid to go into local pubs for fear of attack, because they were now viewed as evil people, unwilling to provide for terminally ill children. In fact, the Birders wanted another route that was already in existence, but were overruled. Mud sticks, and it stuck to the Birders. Not invited to the opening, any letter sent to the Bluebell Trust regarding ecological matters is now ignored. The scrapes at Kiveton have dried up, and the plovers have now gone. At the nearby Dinnington Colliery development, they are hanging on, and only 3 chicks were hatched in 2006. Moreover, as we and the SK58 Birders rapidly found out, most of the ecologists employed by Yorkshire Forward and Renaissance South Yorkshire are ecologically illiterate and appear not to know a great deal generally about nature. They are very ineffective, and are probably given the job because they are so useless, but also very adept at blanking letters and ignoring searching questions, likely to expose their ignorance. Their inertia is a protection against the likelihood of this happening, and the high salaries mean their continuing silence and compliance can be relied on. We did everything required of us in terms of informing the authorities, particularly biodiversity groups, and even worked hand in hand with one officially recognised eco-group, SK58 Birders, who were included in the Kiveton master plan. Given we did not live in South Yorkshire, we could hardly have been more hands-on. Though very sceptical from the outset, it was a learning curve for us, and at the end of the day, we were both shocked to find we stood virtually alone, 2 coffin dodgers confronting an unstoppable juggernaut. If we began disillusioned, we are doubly so now, particularly as our faces are now squashed flat from running into endless brick walls elsewhere. If what's left of the Dingy Skipper in South and West Yorkshire is to be saved, different tactics to the strict legalism and procedures we adhere to will have to be deployed. We have long held that only direct action by a large number of people living close by, as well as elsewhere, will change things for the better. The saving of the Dingy Skipper is no exception. And so these unofficial spoil heap wildlife havens, that had a long way to go before they reached their natural climax, are turned into featureless, denatured development projects made up of housing and warehousing, together with the occasional amenity park, as Kiveton was to become, with scarcely a voice raised in protest. Ian Bramley, of Regeneration Consultants Renaissance South Yorkshire, had the barefaced cheek to say, "The reclamation programme will transform a site which currently offers nothing to the community into one which provides a recreational area where people could enjoy a range of outdoor pursuits." He also refers to the project as an investment which will create the potential for associated developments. And there we have it. These spoil heap reclamation schemes are a form of trading on the futures market. This is easily as mercenary as the trade in dead stock, which never pretended to be anything other. What's more, it never presumed to cover itself in the mantle of maximum sensitivity to human needs, which is increasingly typical of today's sales pitch. A good friend of ours, whose home backs onto the makeover, said in an email, "It has a look of Teletubby land, if you ask me. Maybe Poe and Laa-Laa are endangered species, you tell me." Yes, the whole thing is Disney-like, and Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse would not look out of place here. A fanfare of publicity nowadays always attends proposed developments such as these. The Treasury's recent innovative use of the media using nature conservation as the pretext serving to underline the fact. Reclamation scheme master plans are thrown open to the public, and everyone can express an opinion, from councillors, local residents, to environmental interest groups, teachers to school children. Nothing on paper could be more consultative, issue-conscious and democratic, with apparently exhaustive consultative procedures implemented in this instance by the Kiveton Park and Wales Community Development Trust and other bodies under the umbrella of English partnerships. A Rotherham councillor, Carl Barton, had stressed that he wanted local people to have control over the development and would be pushing for as much local consultation as possible. And yet always the result is tragically different to that intended by the facade of a seemingly ever more inclusive democracy. If the pet gerbils of school children could speak, they would assuredly be given a voice, only to then find that, instead of the cage door being thrown wide open, even their treadmill will turn now faster. This is the bitter truth, an increasingly thin democracy, falsely claiming to be all ears, but which operates according to globally competitive criteria, and which has to follow the growth agenda, i.e. the maximisation of profit, or perish. This postmodern neoliberalism is also characterised by an obsessive spiral of subcontracting, which constantly verges on a bad, money-driven anarchy and the loss of anything like overall control. The Cheetham Hill Construction Company, employed to do the job of covering up the spoil, prides itself on being a hollowed-out company, good at getting the business contracts and then subcontracting the dirty work out to other companies that then operate under its logo as if they were all one and the same company. At no point did the left hand ever know what the right hand was doing, a situation which applies across the board today. Although we clearly indicated the areas where the Dingy Skipper flourished, the instructions always managed to get lost as they were passed down the line, the buck stopping nowhere. The whole setup is so damn crazy, it would be hilarious if it wasn't so tragic. We first heard that the Kiveton Park spoil heap was to be given a facelift sometime in the late 1990s from Jenny, the wife of the miner John Dennis, mentioned at the beginning of this film. As British Waterways initially had shown interest in developing the site, everyone assumed some kind of marina would be the likely outcome, as a branch of the Chesterfield Canal once run through the colliery grounds. Interestingly, in the late 1970s, Jenny, as a Labour Party councillor, had overseen the development of the Rother Valley Country Park, which today hosts probably more than the one Dingy Skipper colony we definitely know is there. Jenny still has all the paperwork relating to the country park, and one day we intend going through it, for it cost a mere fraction of the £9.6 million spent on the far smaller Kiveton Park makeover. The Rother Valley Country Park was a spin-off of the 1968 Countryside Act that gave local councils the authority to construct country parks. This had formerly been the province of the National Park Commission since the National Park and Countryside Act of 1949. Unlike national parks, they were not necessarily places of beauty, but intended primarily for enjoyment. Though the conservancy function had been split off into various conservation councils, an amenity park like the Rother Valley became, within a few years, as good as many an officially designated nature reserve. The Kiveton Amenity Park can never hope to equal it. When compared to the apparently exhaustive consultative procedures, in fact an authoritarian state-directed contrick, of recent years, the result of the Rother Valley Country Park was 1,000,000 times better. Local consultation was minimal, but if objections were raised, they were more likely to be listened to than today, for in the 1970s protests still counted for something. For instance, had alien soil been brought in from outside, the cry of protest would have gone up, not least, as Jenny made clear, from local mining communities. Without a doubt, the ground is, to quote, contaminated, and children are asked not to swim in the attractive little lakes at the bottom of the valley because of the heavy metal contamination as a result of the upwelling of water from the mine workings below. All the soil dug from 300 metres below, that wasn't coal, created huge mounds of dead ground, and after 300 million years of internment, it certainly wasn't rich soil either. But leguminous seed was scattered far and wide, leading to a natural process of regeneration, for plants like clover, trefoil and vetch harbour a microbe in their root system able to convert the nitrogen in the atmosphere into nitrate-based fertilizer that over time enriches these nutrient-poor wastes, leading to a further natural succession of plant and animal life. This is in complete contrast to the ground zero purification of the spoil and eradication of the former outline of the Kiveton Park spoil heap, and which was also threatening on account of the historical memory it conjured up, especially the most traumatic and consequential conflict of modern times, the miners' strike of 1984-85. The mass manufacture of amnesia is central to the makeovers now taking place at Kiveton, Dinnington, Orgreave, Thurcroft, Woolley, Grimethorpe and elsewhere. As that must now include the nature that once existed there as well as miners, it does suggest that authority is deeply fearful of a coming together of eco-radicalism and social struggle, of wild nature and wild ex-miner that is now long overdue.